He has literally written the book on this, and it's an award-winning book. So he is truly the man on this, and lots of other things having to do with the way Korea has faced outward from the Cold War on. Professor Mitchell Lerner received his BA from Brandeis University and his PhD from the University of Texas, Austin. His research and teaching focus on modern American diplomatic and political history during the Cold War, with an emphasis on U.S.-Korean relations. He came to Ohio State in 2000 and is now the director of OSU's Institute for Korea Studies. He has received fellowships and grants from the Korea Foundation, the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library, Dwight Eisenhower Presidential Library, and the JFK Presidential Library, where he won the Kovler Fellowship in Foreign Intelligence in 2001. Professor Lerner was elected to the Governing Council of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations in 2008 and is on the advisory board of the North Korea International Documentation Project, directed by the Cold War International History Project at the Wilson Center. Professor Mitch Lerner.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I'm not much of a microphone person. I'm actually incredibly loud. To teach at OSU, sometimes you get these classes with that are like in football stadiums with hundreds of students. So I'm assuming you can hear me okay in the back? Yes? Is that good? Okay, if you can't hear me and you want me to go back, please let me know, but I just assume we prefer to work without the microphone. Thank you, Jason, for the introduction, and to the volunteers at the museum and everyone else who worked to make this possible. I'm honored to be here. I assume that most of you are regulars, and I probably don't have to plug the museum for you, but I will anyway. It's obviously a great facility, and it's an important step in trying to remember this often overlooked aspect of our past. So if you're not involved with it, if you've not explored it, or you've not been involved in this programming, I urge you to do so. And particularly, I want to thank Jason for the great job that he's done in trying to commemorate the past for us. So I've actually given hundreds of talks in my academic life. This one is full of firsts. It's the first time I've ever been surrounded by beer and drinking one while I give a talk. So I'm supposed to drive back to Ohio tonight. This is really good. If someone has a couch, I might need a place to crash, so to speak. So lots of firsts. It's the first time I've given a talk like this. First time I've given one with beer. It's also maybe the first time I've done one with my daughter in the audience. Hello, Julia. So my daughter, Julia, is about to be a senior at the University of Maryland. And I came by this weekend to actually give a talk at the NSA, but also to help her move into her new place. Because, proud father alert, Julia is spending the summer as a junior fellow at the Library of Congress. And has done all sorts of wonderful things, so I came out to help her, and now I'm bringing her back to Ohio for a couple days. So hi, Julia. And if I need another beer, you'll be the one to run off and get it. Thank you. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. So I also have to remember when I start talking about Korea and the Pueblo, this is a topic that I've spent most of the last couple of decades studying. And it's one of those things my wife might sometimes call it that boat that I'm obsessed with. I figured I needed to sort of build myself some sort of organizational framework here. I could talk about this for hours and hours, but cognizant of the fact that we've got like a 90-minute or so limit that includes some time for Q&A, I thought I'd better build some kind of organized framework here so that I don't just ramble on. So although the topic, the title of the topic is the Pueblo incident, a better title might be this. Here's the top 10 things we now think we probably know about the Pueblo incident, within some small modicum of certainty, or at least with a pretty decent possibility that it's mostly accurate in general, although that may all change down the road and maybe even by the time that I'm done talking. There's a couple important qualifiers in there. First, we're starting it as a top 10 things list, and just to make me not feel so old like I do when I make a pop culture reference to my students. You guys get that, right? Top 10 things, you recognize this. How many of you remember the David Letterman top 10 lists? Most of you good, because I swear to God, sometimes I make these references to the Brady Bunch or something, Mork and Mindy, and my students look at me like I'm completely insane. So I'm glad we did that one. And the other qualification, of course, is that information is still leaking out about this incident. There's been a number of books recently, lots of articles, there's been some material we've gotten out from the North Korean side, but we're still getting more information. And the simple reality is that if I have to tell anyone in this room, that the two entities that are really most directly related to the captured USS Pueblo are the National Security Agency and North Korea. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, those are not entities that are really happy about sharing information, particularly with me. So there's still a lot of stuff that trickles out every day. We're not really sure at any given moment how much the story's going to change. One more first for you that makes this an unusual talk. Yesterday when I gave my talk at the NSA, I realized I could barely read my notes. So in a very, very sad moment, I'm going to wear my glasses in public giving a talk for like the first time ever. So this is kind of a sad moment for me and really making me feel kind of old. But, so we're starting with our top 10 framework. Let me start with the real basics. Now, I may not have to do this in this room. Most of you probably are familiar with the general background here. But it's always struck me how little the American people paid attention to the captured USS Pueblo, both in terms of historical memory and even back in 1968, where the ship was captured and there was this great wave of sort of animosity and calls for revenge, and then it just kind of got pushed off the front page of the newspapers between the Vietnam War and all the other chaos of 1968. So I thought maybe to start off, I should at least give you some general background and make sure we're on the same page. So pictured here, of course, is the USS Pueblo. It is a tiny, dilapidated cargo ship. It comes in at 177 feet long and 33 feet wide. It was built in 1944 as a general-purpose supply vessel for the U.S. Army, and it served in World War II and beyond with some distinction. Pueblo went about 10 years without incident. In 1954, it was deemed expendable and retired. The retirement lasted about 10 years. In 1966, it was pulled out of retirement, I mean literally taken out of mothballs, rust scraped off it, and it was transferred to the Navy to transform it into a naval intelligence vessel. Pueblo would be the second ship in Operation Click Beetle. Click Beetle was a joint program run by the National Security Agency and the Navy, and what it did is it took these former old cargo carrier ships, these dilapidated old nothing ships, and he converted them for top secret signals intelligence intercept missions. And mostly what that meant was it had a special operations department, what they called the sod hut, kind of welded on top, where communications technicians operated intelligence intercept gear, and then Click Beetle sent these ships off the coast of enemy nations to eavesdrop and see what kind of information they could get. The Pueblo was the second such ship. The first one was the USS Banner. It's probably worth noting that Click Beetle is actually born as an imitation of something the Soviets were already doing. So the Soviets started running these ships in the 1950s. By the time the Pueblo was captured, the Soviets have about 50 of these AGIs, as they call them, these sort of mobile eavesdropping ships that they routinely sent off the coast of the United States. The United States was aware of these, we monitored them, we knew where they were operating, but as long as they stayed in international waters, everyone just sort of turned a blind eye to it. I mean, maybe a little bit of harassment and some superficial protests, but the general understanding between the two nations was that as long as the ship stayed in international waters, they would be respected and left alone. Now, that didn't always work out as promised. In the late 60s, there's an interesting moment when one of the Soviet vessels crosses into American territory, really at top speed, off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, with an unusual problem for one of these ships, and it was a problem that was solved when the Navy helicoptered a doctor on board to assist with the delivery of a baby. Not something you think about so often when you think about these type of operations. But so they ran them, and the United States decided that they were going to make the same sort of operation. Now, the first effort to build these ships in 1960 involved combat ships. So the U.S. started by converting combat ships to intelligence interception vessels and sending them off to the coasts. There are a couple of problems, though, with using combat ships for these missions. One is that combat ships are bound by certain maritime conventions that apply to warships, but not these dilapidated ex-fishing vessels. They were also afraid that it would be more noticeable that the enemy was keeping a close eye on America's destroyers and aircraft carriers and other military warships. And so to pull them off their standard operating patrol would garner some attention. More than anything else, though, the idea behind Operation Click Beetle was to be as unprovocative as possible. The idea was that the last thing you wanted to do was start some kind of significant incident. These things were going to operate on their own, in quiet, and so the idea of converting a major warship rather than just this dilapidated old cargo carrier didn't seem like a very good idea. So by the 1960s, the United States begins producing Operation Click Beetle, these smaller dilapidated ships and sending them off to the coasts of other nations. The first one, as I said, was the USS Banner, which started running operations in late 1966. The Banner ran 16 missions, generally without incident, lots of harassment, a couple close calls, but generally speaking, the Banner operated without major controversy. It would, of course, not be the same for the second ship in Click Beetle program. That's the USS Pueblo. So Pueblo left for her first mission on January 11th, 1968, departing from Japan for the coast of North Korea. Officially, it was an oceanographic vessel. In fact, it actually carried with it 2 civilian oceanographers who were charged with doing routine water tests, depth, temperature, salinity, that sort of thing. And the whole cover story was based on the idea that it was just researching the oceans. In reality, of course, it's got a much more complicated mission. Pueblo was sent to operate off the coast of 4 North Korean ports. The general operational orders called for it to just sample the electronic environment, intercept any information you can from any of these 4 port cities, as well as any ships operating in the region. A bunch of other secondary missions, a bunch of other secondary tasks underlay the mission. The Navy wanted the Pueblo to operate off the island of Man-do, where they thought that the new North Korean submarine fleet was operating. They wanted to get information on the submarine fleets. They had also noticed a new type of surface-to-air missile built along the coast of North Korea. They wanted any information you could get on those. They were also tasked with monitoring Soviet ships that sometimes operated near Wonsan or off in the Tsushima Straits, so keeping an eye on them. The National Security Agency had its own kind of secondary task. The NSA wanted the Pueblo. They had noticed that the North Korean military was relying less and less on their VHF communication system, and they wanted the Pueblo to either figure out why, did they have some kind of new system, or find out, or go back to intercepting what they had missed with the VHF communication. In the end, in reality, I think that that's all sort of papering over the general function. I think that what really happened here was that people decided first on the target and then built the mission to fit around it. Right? We want something on North Korea. It's a dangerous place. Go. We're sending you to North Korea. What reasons should we have for you to look? What things should we have for you to look at while you're there? So it was really sort of the tail wagging the dog. After operating without incident for about 2 weeks, Pueblo took up a position outside of Wonsan Harbor, North Korea. On the 22nd, January 22nd, while operating outside Wonsan, 2 North Korean trawlers came by. They stopped, made a beeline for the Pueblo, circled a few times at a distance of about 25 yards. Clearly, Pueblo had been spotted. They pulled over a little bit, watched the ship, trying to determine exactly what was going on. Then they made a beeline into Wonsan Harbor. Pueblo had obviously been spotted. The commander, Pete Booker, decided this was nothing to worry about, so he didn't take many actions. Pueblo, at the time when it was spotted, wasn't flying any signs of American nationality, no flags, no signals, nothing like that. In fact, the oceanographers, at the time they were first spotted, were actually conducting tests of the local waters. The North Koreans had displayed no hostile intent, and besides all of that, Booker had been ordered to expect routine harassment. This sort of thing happened. And that the Banner had experienced it on almost every mission. You were spotted by the enemy, they sent ships out to maybe circle you and even kind of bump into you and try to intimidate you, but you were supposed to tough it out. In fact, the ship's sailing orders said that one of the things they were trying to test were the target nation's reaction to the ship and the ship's ability to handle it. So Booker wasn't all that concerned. The only action he took was to order the ship to break radio silence. And prepare a situation report to send back to DC through the Naval Communications Station in Japan. However, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, this is pretty typical of the Pueblo, the communications gear didn't really work. So they wrote up the SITREP, they wrote up the situation report in the afternoon of the 22nd, but they couldn't connect to Kamasea to actually send it until the morning of the 23rd. They spent all night trying to link up. They finally did shortly before things went to hell in a handbasket, frankly. So the next morning is January 23rd. The men are sitting down to an early lunch at about 11 o'clock when a message comes down from the deck that a North Korean subchaser who had been spotted on radar and was coming at them at top speed. Commander Booker went up to operate. By the time he got up to the deck, there were 2 North Korean subchasers, soon followed by 4 North Korean torpedo boats and 2 Soviet-built MiG-17s flying overhead. After a few passes around Pueblo, the lead subchaser rang up signal flags that said, heave to or I will open fire. Bucher couldn't believe it. In fact, he wondered if maybe heave to had a different meaning in North Korea, and he wasn't sure what it meant. They actually had to go through sort of various naval manuals to see if maybe the North Koreans meant something else, but they didn't. They wanted the ship to stop, get in the water, and be boarded. The last minute, so then the lead subchaser started backing down towards Pueblo with about a dozen men armed at battle stations on the stern of the boat, clearly ready to board Pueblo. At the last second, Pueblo's engines jumped to life. Ship headed towards open seas, and Bucher thought maybe for a minute they were going to escape. In fact, he rang up signal flags. Thank you for your courtesy. I am departing the area. Of course, it was not to be. Pueblo could go about 13 knots. The subchaser could go 40. The torpedo boats could go 50. And pretty soon that path to open seas was cut off by the torpedo boats zigzagging in front, forcing the Pueblo to turn off at an angle. Then the ships withdrew, clearly preparing to open fire, and then the North Koreans opened fire on the Pueblo. The ship is decimated. I can go through the details if you want in the Q&A, but the bottom line is there's shrapnel and glass and fire everywhere. Bucher looks into the skies. He's hoping for help, but there's no sign of help coming, and he goes down and talks to the communications technician to report that the Navy has promised only that they're trying to get some help in the air, but they really don't know what's going on. We'll talk more about that later if we have some time. Ordered the men to improvise an emergency destruction, and then recognizing that they couldn't fight their way out, so Pueblo was practically unarmed, and that the best he could do was buy time to advance the interests of the emergency destruction, and hopefully somebody would come on rescue, he decided to stop the ship and surrender. Pueblo surrenders. The lead North Korean subchaser rings up signal flags that say, I have a pilot on board, follow in my wake. Bucher turns the ship and starts following the North Koreans into Wonsan Harbor. About halfway in, though, he goes down below deck where the emergency destruction of the crypto gear and the classified materials are going on. And he goes down and he's horrified as to how badly the emergency destruct is going. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes. But it's really disappointing. So he goes back up to the bridge and he decides he's going to feign mechanical breakdown. He's going to pretend that the ship is having some sort of mechanical failure and just stall for time to advance the interests of the success in the emergency destruction and hoping that some planes will appear on the horizon. So they ring up all stop. The ship halts. Bucher kind of waves at them. Sorry. And the North Koreans have clearly had enough. They turn and they open fire again. Again, the ship is just decimated. Numerous injuries, 4 of them of some severity, and 1 man is killed. Fireman Dwayne Hodges is carrying a weighted bag of classified materials to the open deck that he's going to throw overboard, and he's hit by a shell which tears off his leg at the right hip. He's dead within an hour. At this point, it's clear that Pueblo has no chance. Bucher starts the engines again, but the North Koreans ring up thick signal flags ordering him to prepare to be boarded. North Koreans board the Pueblo. They tie the men up, blindfold them, and hold them in the forward berthing compartment. Bucher is forced at gunpoint to give his North Korean captors a tour of the ship. Along the way, he is horrified at how much classified material he sees is remaining. And then he too is held in the forward berthing deck until the ship suddenly crashes into a pier in Wonsan Harbor, the first of a number of homes that it will have over the course of over the course of going into today. Because as many of you probably know, Pueblo is still held by the North Koreans. It floats now in the Taedong River just north of Pyongyang, where it's one of North Korea's leading tourist attractions. If you go online, you can see they give tours of it, and it's really quite comical. The guy who used to give the tour claimed that he was part of the original group that captured the Pueblo, even though he was 40 years old. This happened 50 years ago. And it's so, the North Koreans have never really understood American intelligence, and so they have everything wrong inside the ship, but nevertheless, it's one of their most popular tourist attractions. So that's the story of the Pueblo on a basic level, and the question I get asked all the time, I meant to show you this picture of the ship. So here's the Pueblo, and the famous thing about this ship, and I mentioned to you how bad the communication systems were in this ship and how mechanically it was really terrible. Anybody tell me what's wrong with that photo? Got any naval people in here?
Any antennas?
Right, so the first thing is we're trying to claim that this is a civilian oceanographic vessel, and by the way, it's got an antenna, can't even see some of them, like, you know, all of them bristling back here. But just on this photo, the ship's going backwards. You know why it's going backwards? It can't go forwards. That's how bad the Pueblo was. Its steering engine has failed so many times. In this moment, the ship can't go forwards, it can only go backwards. So, we'll get to that more in a minute. So that's the ship tied up in the Pueblo River. So, the critical question I get asked all the time, how could this have happened? How could an American spy ship be captured like this? Men held for a year. How could this have ever happened? So I'm going to give you two answers. One is really specific and has a lot of different points, and the other one is sort of the broader failure that underlies it. On an immediate level, the answer to how this could have happened is simply that the Pueblo was so unbelievably ill-prepared for its mission that you wouldn't believe the stories I could tell you. Let's start by talking about its defensive capabilities. The Pueblo has almost no means to defend itself. Below deck, it's got in locked storage compartments about a dozen Thompson submachine guns, a few handguns, a few grenades, and some other minor things. Its primary means of self-defense are two .50 caliber machine guns that are operating on the deck. The problem with, amongst the many problems with the machine guns, in accordance with naval regulations, they are required to be covered by tarps because they didn't want to be provocative. Remember, this is going to be a non-provocative, you know, we're just going to look like an oceanographic vessel. So the Navy required them to keep the tarps across the machine guns. You sent this ship to the East Sea, what we sometimes call the Sea of Japan, in January. So what do you think happens? The tarps freeze. They're covered by a couple inches of ice. So in that moment where you're under attack, where you might actually need your weapons, you have to crawl out to the bow of the ship and chisel away a couple inches of ice so you can get the tarps off. It gets worse because the ammunition is stored in the lock boxes below deck. There's one guy who's charged with bringing the ammunition up to the guns, except no one's giving him a key. So he doesn't even know how to do it, even if he could. It's worth noting as well that the machine guns were installed at the last minute. Remember, the whole notion of Operation Click Beetle was that these things weren't supposed to be provocative. So why on earth at the last minute did they install .50 caliber machine guns? The USS Liberty. In the wake of the attack on the Liberty, some vice admiral got a bee in his bonnet and ordered all of these ships needed to be armed. Commander Bucher was furious. He correctly saw that this was just enough of a defense system to be provocative, but not enough to actually help him defend himself. In the few months that they had before they left port, they experimented with the guns. There were very few of the men had training in them, but even the ones that did couldn't hit a floating object from 50 yards. And it's worth noting as well that because of the addition of all of these antennas and the other things that we just mentioned, the ship was so unbelievably top-heavy that there was a real threat of it capsizing. I mean, this is shocking. They're sending the ship on its first mission off the coast of North Korea, and they have to worry about it capsizing because it's so heavy on the top. And so that means that the Navy refuses to install armor to protect the men firing the guns. There's no gun tubes. There's nothing. So even if you are somehow able to get to the gun and get the ammunition in, you're operating them in the face of, 4 North Korean torpedo boats shooting at you with absolutely no protection. Now, all of this might have been acceptable if the Navy had support forces on call to help the Pueblo in case of crisis, but unfortunately they did not. The Pueblo was so top secret that the Navy didn't want to talk about it to anybody, and so they kept it really under wraps, and so no support forces were on call. The 5th Air Force, for example, had planes at Osan, South Korea, that could have been there on time if they had been placed on call and were ready, but instead no one had bothered to mention it to them, so most of their planes were configured with bomb racks to carry atomic weapons. And by the time it took them to take the bomb racks off and fit them with conventional weapons, it was too late to do anything about it. And this was a story everywhere. The USS Enterprise, the nation's most powerful aircraft carrier, was 400 miles away from Pueblo, could have had planes there in less than 2 hours if they had been warned in advance. Instead, not only had no one told the Enterprise that the Pueblo was operating in their area, no one told the Enterprise what the Pueblo was. And so when messages started coming to the Pueblo leadership, to the Enterprise leadership, saying the Pueblo was in trouble, they had to figure out what the Pueblo was before they did anything about it. And by the time they realized what it was, too late to get planes in the air. The one place that actually did react was the Air Force Base in Okinawa, which launched about a dozen F-102s, F-105s in defense of the Pueblo, but they too had no idea that the Pueblo was in the area. So had they been warned and had people on call, they would have had pilots sitting in planes fueled and ready to go. Instead, they had to recall a number of planes from training missions, they had to fuel them, they had to brief the pilots, and so by the time they got in the air, it was too late for them to help Pueblo. Other problems worth mentioning to answer the how could this have happened question. Pueblo's navigation and steering systems were an absolute joke. Their LORAN positioning system was typically about 5 miles off, so they never really knew where they were, and they were forced often to navigate by celestial navigation. Their steering engine, which had the somewhat important mission of turning the ship, you're going off to the coast of North Korea on your first mission, that seems sort of important. The steering engine failed constantly. It had been built in 1944 by a Wisconsin elevator company that went out of business after World War II and took all the spare parts with them. So even when the Navy recognized how badly the steering engine failed, which they did, and the Navy knew it, they sent a team to study it. There was no way to fix it. And so the only way to make the Pueblo steerable was to redo the whole steering engine. And that was going to cost tens of thousands of dollars that the Navy didn't want to spend. So the men were told, essentially, just live with it. I found the Pueblo's log book that went up to December 1968, right before it left for Korea, which is at the Naval Historical Center. I'm going to read you just one entry. This is, now remember, again, you go to North Korea, for God's sakes, right? This isn't a vacation in the Bahamas. This is going to be your first mission ever, and you're going off the coast of North Korea. On November 12th, almost exactly 2 months before they leave for that mission, here's the deadline. 0800 hours, underway as before. 8:25, lost electrical steering, all engines stopped. 8:26, regained electrical steering, all ahead full. 8:29, lost electrical steering, all stopped. 8:33, shifted to manual steering. 8:34, all ahead standard, shifted to electrical steering. 8:39, all ahead full. 9:09, lost electrical steering, all stopped. 9:10, shifted to manual steering. 9:10, regained electrical steering. 9:14, lost electrical steering, all stopped. 9:15, all ahead standard. 9:16, port engine ahead full, starboard ahead standard. 9:17, all ahead full, regained electrical steering. 10:05, starboard engine overheating. 10:07, starboard engine stopped. This is how the deck log goes. Engines failing, communication system failing, ship is going to capsize, guns don't work. Let's send it off to North Korea. Lots of other problems worth mentioning quickly. Pueblo has no self-destruct system. Almost all of these ships did because of Pueblo's configuration. They had no ability to sink the ship quickly. We'll talk more about the self-destruct disaster in a moment. The men are ill-equipped. Commander Bucher is a submarine. He's never had command of a surface vessel in his life. This is his first command. The officers are incredibly young and inexperienced. Almost none of them have background in intelligence operations. Maybe most notable, the crew consists of naval intelligence decides at least to be smart. We're intercepting all these Korean messages. That's the point of the mission. Let's get 2 Korean linguists on board so they can monitor Korean communications. They assign them 2 military officers, two soldiers with some Korean training, except they gave them 9 months of Korean language training, and it had been years ago, and so neither man could read or speak Korean really at all. In fact, an internal NSA report later concluded that if these 2 guys had been able to read Korean, they would have gotten notice of the attack 30 to 60 minutes before it took place, but instead they couldn't read it. It was in a stack of messages that they were trying to translate with the help of a Korean dictionary, and in the end, I think that's the ultimate failure, at least in terms of the men. The biggest failure, and this takes us to what I was going to say with regard to the larger failure. Biggest failure is the risk assessment process. Now, none of the click-beetle operations could go forward unless the mission was analyzed at all sorts of intelligence community levels, and the mission risk had to be determined as minimal by all of these independent assessments. It was a minimum of 6 intelligence levels had to analyze the proposed mission, and all of them had to conclude that it was a minimal risk or the mission was scrubbed. In theory, this works pretty well. They were actually given 7 criteria that they were supposed to evaluate the mission on. In the end, to my estimate, probably should have failed 5 of them. They included things like, some of them are really basic, things like the anticipated weather in the region, right? January off North Korea. Then there was the expected hostility of the target nation and the political climate in the area. and the the ship's mechanical abilities. On all of these and more, Pueblo should really have failed. It didn't. Why did it fail? Lots of reasons. The way this process worked, the Pueblo mission was evaluated at 6 different levels. The problem is, Pueblo mission was never evaluated on its own. It was pushed up the chain of command as part of the monthly intelligence collection book, which meant every intelligence mission over the course of that month was combined into one massive book to be studied at each of these analytical levels. Each of these levels, with one exception, analyzed this massive collection in one day. So they had this material that was hundreds of pages of different missions. They analyzed them all in the course of a day and concluded that it was minimal risk. They didn't pay much attention to any of the specific missions. They didn't pay much attention to the ship itself. There's an incredible amount of groupthink that sort of goes along. There's lots of other problems that underlie the way the mission is analyzed, and I can talk about the Q&A if you want, but I'll leave you, before we move on with this slide, what really is at fault here with that risk assessment and the guns and the steering engine and everything else is one thing. And you can kind of see it in this last sentence that I got in bold here, which you may not be able to read, but this says estimate of risk is minimal, since the Pueblo will be operating in international waters for the entire deployment. What underlies all of this is a simple assumption. So I joke that the Pueblo is a floating Cold War metaphor. And what I mean by that is, Pueblo is sort of the story of America's Cold War, in that the US government was unable to distinguish between the Soviets and all the rest of the communist bloc. But the idea that this is kind of the story of Vietnam. Oh my God, they're communists, they must be part of a larger communist conspiracy, rather than the possibility that it might have been sort of an independent, indigenous, nationalist movement. Well, that's what underlies the problem here. In the eyes of the American intelligence community, we had an understanding with the Russians. And we did. As long as the ship stayed in international waters, we ran it against them, they ran it against us, everybody was okay with it. And no one ever said, wait a minute, North Korea is not Russia. Like, just because the Soviets accept this, do we have some assurance that the ship is going to be equally as safe off the territorial waters of North Korea? Everybody in the intelligence community assumed yes. There was this general, and actually I'm overstating when I say everybody, because there's lots of voices behind the scenes saying, oh my God, this is a stupid idea. There's actually a message that NSA, before the ship leaves, NSA looks at the mission risk and says, oh my God, this is terrible. And they send messages to naval intelligence hinting that they should cancel it, and naval intelligence doesn't pay much attention. Because in the end, what everybody assumed was, we do this against the Soviets, they do this against us, and we all just accept it. So that brings us to what happens next. What's the American response to the attack on the Pueblo? It probably will not surprise you to note that the immediate American response is one rooted in hostility and anger, calls for revenge and vengeance sweep the country. The Buffalo Daily News writes that, quote, there should be no mincing in our demand for the swift and safe return of both ship and crew, nor should North Korea be deprived for long of the dose of retribution her sudden belligerency has so emphatically asked for. Congressman Mandel Rivers went farther. He said, quote, I'd select a target. I'd do like Truman did. Let one of them disappear. The military seems to agree. When word finally hits military leadership that the Pueblo has been captured, they start passing down the chain of command all sorts of responses, military response plans. The initial one that looked like it might go forward, Navy immediately sent a bunch of destroyers to the area. They devised a plan where the next morning, 4 of the destroyers were going to charge into Wonsan Harbor at daybreak. One of them would be specifically carrying a detachment of Marines who would pull into Wonsan Harbor under air cover from Enterprise jets, and they would board the Pueblo, kill any of the North Koreans who were over there, cut the ship loose, and tow it out. When that plan was rejected, another plan was taken pretty seriously, and that involved sending about a dozen American F-105s into Wonsan Harbor at the break of dawn to destroy Pueblo. At that point, they decided we're not going to be able to save the ship or the men, but Pueblo's carrying all sorts of top secret stuff. Let's go in and destroy it. Now, the incredibly heavy air defenses in Wonsan Harbor meant that this was a suicide mission, and everybody knew it. These were 12, they had, I think they were going out of Osan, if I remember correctly, and the colonel who was in charge of the mission gathered his men together and told them point blank this was pretty much a suicide mission, and it was unlikely any of them were coming back. But the next morning, all 12 of them were sitting in the cockpits of their planes, ready to go, waiting for that order to go in and destroy the Pueblo. but the order never came. In the end, the military mounted a huge collection of assets in the region, 4 aircraft carriers, I think 15 destroyers, 9 submarines, the banner is sent, air assets built up everywhere from Osan, Kanesea, and elsewhere. And the United States appears ready to go. But in the end, the Johnson administration follows a diplomatic path. And I think there's 4 reasons as to why they chose diplomacy as the way out. One was that, and this is something that I think speaks to Lyndon Johnson and the struggles that he was going through maybe in '68. He wanted the man home alive. And maybe that's to his credit. Johnson said over and over again, the military keeps giving me these plans to go in and do something, but none of them are going to save the men. And to his mind, he had to get the men back alive. He felt, and his administration actually felt real guilt that they had sent these men on this mission that was so badly prepared, they really wanted to bring them home alive. They were also, second factor, they were terrified of sparking another war with the Chinese or even the Soviets. Right? And even though behind the scenes, and we'll talk about this in a minute, Johnson had reached out to the Soviets and they had established kind of a behind the scenes back channel communications to keep things under control, and LBJ knew the Soviets hadn't been part of it and were trying to keep things restrained. Accidents happen. And Johnson knew that. It was one of the lessons I think he took from the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy works quietly behind the scenes to make sure that we don't go to war, and yet there's a moment when a U-2 spy plane is shot down by Cuban commanders on the ground in Cuba without Soviet authorization, and the American military wants to respond. And so despite everything Kennedy had done to try to avoid war, we almost ended up there anyway. And I think Johnson takes that lesson and thinks, if we mine Wonsan Harbor and a Chinese or a Soviet ship accidentally goes over the mine, what happens next? The third factor that I think underlies this decision is that the South Koreans were really complicating things for the United States as well. South Korean President Park Chung-hee wanted to march north. And it's worth noting, we Americans look at the Pueblo in sort of its isolated context as if it's the only thing that's going on at that point. The Korean Peninsula was awash in violence from about 1968 to 1969. And I'll talk about that later on. But 2 days before the capture of the Pueblo, North Korea sends a team of 31 commandos on a mission to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee. And it misses by like feet. These 31 commandos, they've been trained for years. They cut through the DMZ and they kill some people along the way. And they get within a mile of the Blue House, which is their South Korean equivalent of the White House. They're within a mile when a suspicious South Korean policeman stops them, demands identification, sets off a firefight. 30 of the North Koreans are killed. The other one is captured. But South Korea is irate. Like, they want revenge. Oh my God, the North crossed the parallel and attacked our president and almost killed him. And it's everything the United States can do to keep them from marching north before the Pueblo. The United States doesn't want another war in the Korean Peninsula. We're fighting in Vietnam. And so Johnson is aghast by this possibility, and the American generals have to put incredible pressure on South Korea to keep them restrained. And so Johnson knows in the back of his mind, if he authorizes any sort of military response against the North, Park Chung-hee is going to see that as the green light to go, and we're going to have a war in Korea. And the final reason why he doesn't go north is an obvious one, and it's the one that I just mentioned, and that's Vietnam. Right? Secretary of State Dean Rush will say to Johnson, I feel badly for the men, but he says, one war at a time is enough. And so with the chaos of Vietnam and the chaos of '68, Johnson decides on a peaceful approach. It's one I would note that costs him a little bit politically. The Milwaukee Sentinel editorializes, they say, the American bird is no longer hawk, it's no longer eagle, hawk, or dove, it's chicken. And there's this sort of backlash a little bit against LBJ for adopting this peaceful resolution. But it's one that he took and stuck by, and I think it's to his credit. Now, there's another point I want to make about the American response. And I've never had to make it, well, before my talk session, I've spoken about the Pueblo dozens of times. Until yesterday, I've never had to make this point. This will be only the second time that I've shown any sort of slide like this. So we're going to call this 8B, Part 2. So here's slide number 8, Part 2, about the American response. In the wake of the 50th anniversary of the Pueblo attack in this January, there was this spate of articles, some of you probably saw them, about how close the U.S. actually came to nuclear war over it. Right? Newsweek had an article, Time had one. This is the Smithsonian. They actually interviewed me extensively for this. Time U.S. nearly nuked North Korea. The most famous one was this one in CNN, which is a massive article, and it got all sorts of attention. And in the first paragraph, very proudly, the author, James Griffin, talks about how this is all new information based on declassified materials and secret interviews and top secret this and that. And it's a great story, it's powerful, and it's emotional, and it's scary. The only thing is, it's completely wrong. We didn't come even remotely close to nuclear war over the Pueblo. The problem with these articles is two things. One is that the authors ignored the fact, and I know many of you probably ex-government people, and this will not be surprising to you, the government studies everything. It doesn't mean that's policy. So the Pueblo was captured, and Johnson ordered the Defense Department study the military responses. They prepared studies of absolutely everything, including possibly using nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean it was actually taken seriously. So they're massive collections of reports. They're like this big. You can go back now if you want to sort of cherry pick your evidence and pick 2 pages of that and say, look, yeah, we were thinking about nuclear war. We really weren't. It was just part of the basic planning steps that everybody takes all the time, and there's no evidence that it was taken seriously. The other failure is that even if this was the case, even if the military wanted to go nuclear, which they did not, in fact, you'd be surprised maybe how quickly the military sort of turned and was all in favor of diplomacy in this incident. But even if the military had wanted war, civilians are still in charge. And there was not even a moment where the Johnson administration considered the possibility of using nuclear weapons. On January 24th, the day after the seizure, they had 3 strategy meetings inside the White House to discuss options. The defense community was represented by Secretary of Defense McNamara and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Earl Wheeler. They talked about all the military options: mining Wonsan Harbor, turning the South Koreans north, rescue missions, capturing a North Korean ship. Everything was discussed. They never even talked about nuclear weapons. Like, I don't even mean they broached it and then they decided not to. The words never came out of anyone's mouth. 5 days after the Pueblo was captured, the Defense Department sent a huge collection of options to the Johnson administration. There's a big stack of 11 possibilities for military options that they were recommending. The Johnson administration studied them. They included, this is the thing, mining Wonsan Harbor, rescue missions, that sort of thing. Rejected them all as too risky. Right, so if mining the harbor is too risky, the idea of maybe using a nuclear weapon, obviously kind of absurd. So beyond the American response, here's something that will probably be of interest to some of the people in this room. The impact of the intelligence loss on American intelligence operations. Immediately after the ship was captured, LBJ ordered an intelligence community assessment of the ramifications of the damage. They concluded that it was, quote, not vital. A message that the Johnson administration quickly leaked to the media and tried to get that message across. Shortly thereafter, though, the NSA did its own internal report. They concluded that the damage was, quote, a major intelligence coup without parallel in modern history. I think we now know the NSA assessment was the more accurate one. The problem here is that the ship doesn't have a destruct system. And so men were told to kind of improvise the best they could in destroying the classified gear and the classified materials. Pueblo went to sea with about 600 pounds of top secret documents. And over the course of their 2 weeks of operation, picked up another 8,000 SIGINT messages translated, sent across by various communication systems. The men were told, so their primary means of disposal of these materials were about a dozen weighted bags that they were supposed to fill with paper, take to the open deck, and throw overboard. Now, first of all, there's not nearly enough. A dozen weighted bags isn't even remotely enough for the massive amount of paperwork that they have. But even if they do, remember, there's no armor topside, so they'd be shot just trying to carry these bags to the top. Pueblo wasn't given an incinerator or a furnace for burning documents. And when Commander Bucher constantly badgered Naval Intelligence to give him an incinerator or a paper shredder, and they refused, he finally took a couple $1,000s that the Navy gave him to spend on crew comforts, and he bought an incinerator and a paper shredder. The problem is, they were all he could afford. They were small, cheap, tiny things that could handle 1 page at a time. Literally 1 page. It's not an exaggeration. In fact, the incinerator was, it didn't have an independent source of flame. It was burnt, it burned as long as you were putting paper in, and the men had found that if you put like 2 or 3 pages in, it smothered the flame, and you had to go through the process of restarting the whole thing. Right? And the paper shredder itself can handle literally 1 page. They have hundreds, thousands of pages of documents they need to shred. Then there's the communication gear itself, which is built into the walls and encased in metal, and yet has no destruct system. The crewmen were given fire axes and sledgehammers and told destroy them that way, which proved to be pretty much impossible. At one point, one of the men, is full of adrenaline. He's, doing all as strong as you could ever imagine. He's so fired up, and he takes a sledgehammer and he hits one of the machines, snaps the wooden handle of the sledgehammer, and the top part, the heavy part, fires back at his head, misses his head by inches. When the ship was captured, all the men told stories about the incredible amounts of documents that were left when they finally got to see the remains of the ship. The NSA has estimated that of the paperwork that was left, somewhere between 50 and 80% of the classified paperwork was left for the North Koreans, who turned it over to the Soviets, and about 95% of the machinery was left. We know from intelligence intercepts that the day after the Pueblo, a plane left Pyongyang for Moscow, carrying 900 pounds of salvage from the Pueblo, various Pueblo machines and other things. At the same time, a Soviet military transport carried Soviet intelligence experts to Wonsan to go through the paperwork and interview the men. And that same day, in fact, NSA intercepted a fax line. This is how kind of backwards technologically the North Koreans were at that point. They were sending the cryptographic machine guidebooks by fax to Moscow, and NSA intercepted them. Among the things we know to have been lost were information about American communications countermeasures, the electronic order of battle for the Far East. We lost the communication, the operation and repair manuals for all of these top secret intelligence machines. We lost the specific intelligence collection requirements, the sort of the guidelines for the areas that we were trying to develop inside East Asia, and so many other things. One of the things that we lost, by the way, and those of you who know something about the intelligence community, this will resonate with you. For November, so let me back up a little bit. Among the machines we lost were KW, lots of machines that we lost. The WLR-37. The most famous one is the KW-7 code radio, and most of you probably know that was it. Right? The KW-7 was our top of the line, send and receive, top secret security communications machine. The way the KW-7 worked, though, required the access of a key card that the intelligence community changed daily. And you would plug that key card in, and that would allow you to decipher messages. Pueblo went to sea with all of the key cards from November and December '68 that should have been destroyed, but they had basically forgotten to destroy them. And the real irony here is that in December of '67, Naval Intelligence sent a reminder to Pueblo, authorized destruction list of everything you're supposed to destroy, and the key cards were on that list, except the post office returned it to Naval Intelligence as undeliverable to this address. So Pueblo never got the reminder. After the ship was captured, and it was clear to the intelligence community that KW-7 had been lost, no one really panicked. Because even though the KW-7 was obviously a huge deal, if you didn't have the key codes, you really couldn't make them work. And so the Naval Intelligence ordered some minor changes. But they didn't really take it all that seriously, because without the key cards, it didn't matter. Except as most of you in this room probably know. Right, whose name am I going to say next? Walker. Johnny Walker is secretly giving these key cards, secretly selling these key cards to the Soviet Union. So although even today there's some dispute among the people who study the intelligence community about exactly what the relationship is there, we can safely say that between the KW-7, Johnny Walker, the Soviets were able to decipher more than 1 million American top secret messages. In fact, there's a Soviet defector from the KGB who has claimed that they had to build a separate building for the team that was assigned to the Walker KW-7 messages because there was so much of them. We can talk more about that later. Let me pick up the pace a little bit. Something I get asked about a lot. What happens to the 82 crewmen? Let me make a couple quick notes here. The men are held captive, as you probably know, for 11 months in 2 separate, first one and then another, North Korean prison camps. Not a lot of places worse than North Korean prison camps. The men are held while the Johnson administration looks for a diplomatic solution. The Johnson administration puts everything out there they can imagine. Anything to try to get these men out, it doesn't work. Kim Il-sung, North Korean president, almost immediately upon the capture of the Pueblo, releases his demand for how this is going to be resolved. He releases a demand for what the intelligence community soon calls the 3 A's. Admit, apologize, assure. Admit that the ship was spying on us and crossed into territorial waters, apologize for doing so, and assure us that it'll never happen again. That's a non-starter in the eyes of the Johnson administration. So they offer anything else. They look for solutions. They ask the United Nations to get involved. They ask the World Court to get involved. They ask the International Red Cross to get involved. The North Koreans won't listen. They start pressuring lots of independent countries who have connections to North Korea to use their influence to help resolve the situation. There's no success. They even work with the Soviets and the Poles and the Czechs behind the scenes, some of the communist bloc nations who had decent relations with North Korea to try to work out a solution. The North Koreans would never yield. They wanted the 3A demand on a written apology letter where there was not going to be a resolution. In fact, at one point, it looks like maybe there's going to be a resolution. It turns out it's all a communications misunderstanding. But the U.S. promises the North Koreans, if you give us an apology, if you give us the 3A demands on a letter, we won't sign it, but we'll write on the bottom, I acknowledge receipt of the men, and then you'll give us the men and we'll give you the letter. And the North Koreans think about that, but it turns out they're just misunderstanding the language the U.S. is using. In October of '68, the State Department Korea desk expert, James Leonard, comes home to his wife, Eleanor, and he's complaining about the situation. Nothing is working. He's convinced the men are going to be there throughout the year, and this is a problem that's going to fall to the Nixon administration. And his wife, Eleanor, offers a solution. She says, offer to sign a 3A's letter, but first publicly denounce it. Repudiate the letter first, and then sign it. Leonard passes that idea up the chain of command. The Johnson administration doesn't think it's going to work. Dean Rusk says, that's crazy. He says it's like a kidnapper kidnaps your son and demands ransom, and then you give him a check, but you tell him, I stopped payment on the check, and he releases your son anyway. But Korean experts said this is going to work. Because the North Koreans don't care about anything else. They just want signature on a piece of paper that they can use for propaganda purposes. And their control of their own people is so tight, no one inside North Korea will ever know that we repudiated it. The offer is made, the North Koreans accept it very quickly, and a couple days later, the 82 surviving men of the Pueblo are released across the bridge of no return. But I want to make another point. As memory fades about the Pueblo, there's a couple things that I think we're starting to lose memory of. A lot of people, particularly those in the military, what they remember about the Pueblo is that the men cooperated in North Korean propaganda efforts. And they did. The North Koreans forced them to write hundreds of letters of apology and admissions of guilt, where they apologized to North Korea and admitted all these horrible things. And the letters went public. They were used in North Korean propaganda, and then they were sent worldwide. They were forced to write letters home to family members, to celebrities, to government officials, to media outlets. They appeared in propaganda inside North Korea, where the North Koreans took them to a concert and a show, even the Museum of American Atrocities, which is one of the most popular tourist attractions inside North Korea. The men gave press conferences. They appeared in public where they criticized the United States and denounced the American government for not apologizing and admitting and assuring. The men got into trouble for this when they got home. And in the eyes of, in a lot of the military circles, they were denounced. And I worry a little bit that this is the memory that has lingered, because I want to qualify a little bit. And I want to defend the men on two levels. One is, I think that anybody can be broken. And the North Korean brutality towards these men is astounding. I mean, I can go into details if you want later, but you can probably imagine, right? 11 months in a North Korean prison camp, that's going to break pretty much anybody. And it's worth noting that as part of what I said earlier, the failure of the American government to really prepare the men, almost none of them had survival, escape, resistance training. Only a few of them did, and even they broke pretty quickly. Because in the fate of torture, nonstop torture by North Korean captors, you kind of do what they say. But here's the other, and maybe the more important point that we risk forgetting. The men quickly recognized that North Koreans really didn't know much about the American language or American culture, and they used that to their advantage to try to send lots of quiet signals to the American government and the American people that they had been coerced and that these weren't legitimate confessions. So the first guy to confess is Commander Pete Booker. He's the one that the North Koreans focus on for the first couple days. They beat him, they torture him, and then they tell him, you got to sign this letter of apology. So he didn't even get to write it. They wrote it for him, and they made him sign it. But they asked him what your serial number was and what your date of birth was, and he gave them fake numbers. Now I know that's really minor, but he was trying to send a message to the American government, one that the American government picked up. And it just moved on from there. In the summer, a team of the men they worked together to write a letter of apology for all of them. It was full of all sorts of exaggerated rhetoric designed to sort of make fun of the situation. In it, Commander Bucher loudly declares to his his second in command, quote, "All right, mister, let's intrude and provocate." One letter home from one of the crewmen told his parents to say hello to Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, and Jack Spratt, his wife. In October, the men worked together to write a confession letter in which they claimed to have been trained by Buzz Sawyer, given orders by Fleet General Barney Google. And if their mission failed, Google warned them, Don Ho would probably give them the dreaded tiny bubbles treatment. And on and on. Now, if you know this very famous picture of the Pueblo, what are the men doing? They're giving them the finger. Because the North Koreans, every Friday night, the men would watch a propaganda film about North Korea. And one of them was a documentary about the North Korean World Cup soccer team that played in London. And then there's a scene where the crew runs into Wembley Stadium before a game, and the crowd of London, I know you'll be shocked by this because normally British soccer fans are so polite and courteous. The North Koreans run up to the stands, and the Londoners give them the finger. And the North Koreans smile, and they wave, and they bow, and the crewmen watch the documentary and say, oh my God, these guys don't know what the finger means. And so for the next couple months, it was a barrage of middle fingers, which the crew said was a Hawaiian good luck symbol. So after torture sessions, they would say, thank you. There was a press conferences, they would sit like this at the front table. There's this famous photo, and many more. In fact, it got so common that the North Korean guards, started giving it to each other. And before one of their most famous press conference, there was a huge international press conference where all these international communist bloc reporters came, and the commander, the general who was in charge of the Pueblo men, came out to the table and looked at the men and said, good luck, I wish you a successful press conference. And I would note, by the way, eventually the North Koreans figured it out. So eventually, a local newspaper, one of the guys writes a letter home to his parents with a photo, and it's this photo, I think it's this photo. And the newspaper reports, so the American government recognized this right away, but they thought if the North Koreans find out, they're going to beat the men senseless, so they never mentioned it publicly. But then a local newspaper did, and then Time Magazine ran the story, and the North Koreans picked it up. And for about a week, they beat the guys, they beat them like you can't even imagine. The worst week of captivity for the Pueblo men. In the end, like we can laugh about, the finger and the Don-O and all that, actually it's kind of important. It let the men survive. I mean, it helped them to go through 11 months of a North Korean prison camp feeling like they were doing something. And I know it's minor, I know it's not escape, but that's the best that they could do. And I think it gave them a sense that at least they had not fully broken, and it got them through the 11 months of captivity. Now I know we're kind of pressed for time, and those of you figuring I've got a top 10 list, and you're doing the math, and you're all smarter than me, you're thinking, oh my God, look at the pace we're going on, this guy is going to be here all night. So I fooled you though. Because whenever I do a top 10 list, and I know I'm going to talk forever, I throw in a slide or two that are absolutely meaningless, and I can go through in 30 seconds. So this is my hockey team. It has actually nothing to do with the Pueblo or North Korea or anything else. So my friend Brian actually works in cyber intelligence. So here's me. Brian played for OSU. He's really good. Checky, he's really good. This is their school superintendent. He's ex-military. All right, so that has nothing to do with the Pueblo. But look at how much time I've just saved as I move on to my next slide. So now let's talk a little bit about North Korea. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in DC had a brilliant idea. They appointed a specific group that was called the Cold War International History Project. The Cold War International History Project was created to try to understand the other side of the Cold War. And they were going to do that by going into the archives of the Soviet bloc states with people who were completely fluent in the language to go through their archives and their materials. We have Soviet experts, German, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Romanians, Albanians, I'm part of this project. And we send them, we fund them, off they go, and they go through these archives, they translate the materials. If you're ever bored, if you want to go look at the webpage, CWIHP, almost all of these are now translated, they're annotated, there's introductions, there's essays written about them. There's oral history conferences that you can watch based on these documents. Well, after a few years, someone said, you know what? We can't get into North Korea, but the more we go through these documents, we're finding lots of stuff about Korea. And particularly what we're finding is all of these Soviet bloc states had embassies inside North Korea, and their ambassadors are sending back reports. And so for the first time, we're able to get a window into what's going on inside North Korea by looking at the materials of the communist bloc states. And although they've led to a lot of, and this is all online also, by the way, NKIDP, North Korea International Documentation Project, all online, searchable. We've got chronologies, we've got essays, it's great stuff. Among the things we've learned about the Pueblo is that North Korea acted completely alone. Now that would have been a controversial thing to say back in 1968, when the Johnson administration was convinced that at first that this was part of a Soviet plot. In fact, within 24 hours of the capture, National Security Advisor, so here's the Cold War in a nutshell. National Security Advisor Walt Rostow said that what we should do is capture a Soviet spy ship, which he said was symmetrical. Right? I mean, think about what that says. North Korea captured one of our ships, so we should capture a Soviet ship, and that's symmetrical? Right? That's the story of the Cold War. That's the story of the American relationship with North Korea, because the idea behind Johnson administration was they're all the same. Within a couple days, the Soviets succeeded in sending back channel messages to the United States saying, we're not involved, and we're going to work to try to end this thing and keep it from exploding. But the Johnson administration was still never able to accept the idea that this might have been a solely North Korean gambit. First they looked at China, then they started looking at larger international conspiracies. They thought maybe it was tied to Berlin. They thought maybe it was tied to Cuba. And then the Tet Offensive broke out, and they realized it must be about Vietnam. The Johnson administration decided that what really happened here was that North Korea and North Vietnam collaborated so that North Korea would capture the Pueblo in time to distract American attention and force the United States to put its resources towards Korea, opening the door for the Tet Offensive that takes place 8 days later. Instead, we now know none of that's true. North Korea acted completely on its own. The day after the capture of the Pueblo, the North Korean Foreign Ministry held a meeting for all ambassadors who had embassies in Pyongyang, where the Deputy Foreign Minister of North Korea opened the briefing by saying he was there to, quote, inform your governments about the invading American armed spy ship seized by our Navy. The attack, he said, was, quote, one you might already have read about in the newspapers. This lack of coordination continued throughout the course of the year. The Hungarians, the Poles, the Czechs, the Soviet Union tried to pressure Pyongyang to release the men and find a resolution. Not only did North Korea refuse, they barely had time to meet with the Soviets. In fact, there's a famous document, and I think this is actually 67, so it's in the earlier part, before the Pueblo was seized, but when the military flare-up has already started, where the Soviet ambassador, in a telegram back to Moscow, says, he laments that he knows this is a crisis situation, and he's sorry he hasn't gotten to meet with Kim Il-sung. He says, I've been trying for 3 weeks, and Kim Il-sung has been too busy to meet with me, but he did just yesterday find time to meet with a group of Japanese prostitutes. This is kind of the frustration that builds on the part of the Soviet Union, as they're trying to have some sort of influence, and nobody is listening. In fact, we now know that not only had North Korea acted alone, but that that in doing so, they drove a pretty significant wedge inside the communist bloc. The Soviets and their allies were irate with the North Koreans. They hadn't been consulted in this attack, and now the North Koreans were threatening to drag them into a larger war. Within about a week, the Soviets sent a message to Pyongyang saying, don't you realize that all you've done is given the South Korean government a chance to arrest all of its dissenters and protesters and stabilize their military government and allow the United States an excuse to build up its own military power in the area? You've got to end this. The North Koreans refused. In late February, the Soviet leadership summons Kim Il-sung to Moscow. He refuses to go. Instead, he sends his foreign minister, who has privately read the riot act by Moscow and told, by the way, you should remember that the treaty we have with you is defensive in nature only, so we are only obligated to fight on your behalf if it's a war of defensive nature, which this clearly is not. And then in April, at the party plenum, it all explodes. Really one of the first times that Communist bloc leaders attack each other in public settings. As we go through the April 1968 Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party plenum, Party General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev attacks the North Koreans. He denounces them for almost drawing us into a war about something we weren't consulted in and how they're not listening, and just really blast them in public, one of the first times that we've seen. The East German ambassador later declares that, quote, and this kind of sums up, I think, the North Korean relationship with the communist bloc, quote, in newspaper articles and statements, we were on their side, but not in reality. And we would now, I think, to some extent, able to explain why they did it. And here there's some controversy, and there are people who no doubt will disagree with me. We have long thought about why the North Koreans captured the Pueblo. Lots of people point to the Vietnam War. Lots of people point to changes inside the Cold War, particularly the Sino-Soviet split. Lots of people look at Berlin or Cuba. Lots of people look particularly at South Korea, and they've argued that North Korea captured the Pueblo because they recognized that South Korea was starting to gain in power and influence, and North Korea was starting to decline. So this was maybe a way to drive a wedge between the United States and the South Koreans, or maybe it would just scare away foreign investment and hurt South Korea's economic growth. But for whatever the reason, the focus has always been international. The bottom line we now know, though, I think North Korea acted for its own reasons rooted in domestic politics. One of the failures, I think, of American foreign policy in the Cold War and beyond is that we as Americans have a tendency to think that dictators can do whatever they want. And to some extent that's true, but it's not always true. Sometimes even the most ruthless, power-crazed dictator has to worry about his political situation and his stability. And I think that's what's happening here. There's a couple things that lie behind this. The North Korean economy starts to collapse in about 1965. Now, we think now North Korea is an economic basket case, and we're right. But what we ignore is that in the wake of the Korean War, the North Korean economy was actually much better than South Korea. Like from 1953 to about 65, North Korea was in much better shape than South Korea was. It's in about 1965 when the economy collapses, and suddenly there's reports of starvation and famine, and South Korea is starting to develop. And so there's some concern inside Kim Il-sung's inner circles that this economic problem could be a crisis for him. At the same time, the Cultural Revolution breaks out in China. Kim is terrified by the Cultural Revolution. Right? You know no doubt the basis of the Cultural Revolution, right? China is crazed. China is awash in revolution. Kim Il-sung thinks, oh my God, this might lead to my own people rising up against me. More likely, he thinks, China might actually invade and take over. We in the United States have this sense of, like, China and North Korea being great allies. They're not. There's a long history of rivalry and fear. And in 1968, Kim is terrified that China might invade over the Yalu River in the north. Things are so bad in 67, 68 that North Korea and China actually fight a number of border conflicts. And there's a moment in 68 where where Chinese Red Guard kill a number of ethnic North Koreans living on the border, and then they put their bodies in these refrigerated railroad cars, seal them, and spray paint across the railroad cars, "You're next, you little revisionist," and then they put the trains back on the tracks into North Korea. And so Kim Il-sung is really starting to be scared. As a consequence, he's starting to get some political heat at home. There's a left-wing group of political leaders who are starting, and I'm not talking coup, we're not even remotely there, just some mild criticism. But it's the first time since 1955 there's been mild criticism. On the left, they're saying, you're not doing enough agriculture. You put all your money in wetlands and heavy industry, people are starving, you've got to change gears. At the same time, there's a military faction saying, oh no, we need less money on consumer spending and more money on military and industrial development. And so Kim Il-sung, as my old Irish ancestors would say, had sort of fallen between two bar stools. And so what's he going to do here? The argument now, I think, is that the reason for this wave of provocation, it can't take the Pueblo out of its short-term circumstance and recognize the larger wave of hostility. So in 1965, North Korea violates the military armistice agreement about 50 times. In 1967, 2 years later, they do it 610 times. Like this, the Korean Peninsula is exploding, culminating with the Pueblo and the Blue House raid. So why? What accounts for all of this? We in the United States, and this is really simplistic, but it's what we call sort of rally around the flag effect. Like this is Kim Il-sung saying, hey, my government might be in a little bit of trouble. How do I survive? I know, I rally people against the West. Right? I'm sorry your kids had to be drafted off to the military, but the West is coming. Right? I'm sorry you don't have enough food to feed your family, but the West has isolated us, has encircled us. It's an excuse for his own shortcomings as a leader and a way to distract his own people from the problems they face at home. There's a telegram, let's see if I can find it. Telegram from the Czech, so summing it up, the Czech ambassador to Pyongyang writes that the spreading military psychosis in North Korea had other functions, like distracting people from the existing economic difficulties, justifying stagnation of the standard of living, demanding the strictest discipline and obedience, and preventing any criticism. That's the story behind the problem. It's got nothing to do with American propagation or the Vietnam War. It's Kim Il-sung worried that his government is collapsing, and this is going to be an excuse for him to stay in power. Again, you're thinking, oh my God, 2 slides left. There's no way we have much more time for this. I got you again. Here's my foot. This has absolutely nothing to do with North Korea or the Pueblo, but American healthcare being as expensive as it is. So you can see my toe is all messed up. So if there's not a chiropractor, a podiatrist. There's a podiatrist in the room who wants to talk later. So I have nerve damage in my feet. I was climbing a rock wall like a year or 2 ago, and I strained I pivoted my foot the wrong way, stretched the nerve taut, and it snapped my big toe. So this is my big toe. That doesn't look right? So if there's a podiatrist who wants to talk later, often I'll actually show this slide in class, and the students don't believe it. So I take my shoe and sock off and I show them. This seems like a more sophisticated audience. So I won't do that. Well, here's a picture. So this is my toe, running off that way. That's not good. But if you want to talk about that, and you have some expertise on toes, please come talk to me. So, let's conclude. I felt like I had to talk a little bit about the contemporary situation in North Korea. Hence, I'm going to my beer right away. I admit that I'm not one of those people who thinks that we can strictly interpret the present by using the past. There's the whole, those who don't learn the lessons of history. So I have students who come to me at the beginning of the semester and say, history always repeats itself. Well, no, it doesn't. I mean, the saying the historians use is, history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. Similar inputs can produce similar outputs, but it's dangerous, I think, to rely too much on the past because that minimizes your attention on the specifics going on now. Every incident needs to be regarded, needs to be evaluated explicitly, and this is the whole point of the Pueblo, It needs to be evaluated explicitly on the current circumstances at that time and place. And we go too far sometimes by saying, well, history shows. So those are kind of a qualifier. So I have some reluctance here. But I thought broadly about it, and I want to give you 3 takeaways that I will conclude with. 3 takeaways about how I think there may be a relationship between 1968 or lessons that we can draw about the crisis of 1968 and how to apply them to today. First of all, North Korea is not giving up its nukes. It just isn't. And it's not simply about defense, in the same way that the Pueblo wasn't about defense. Inside North Korea, they don't want nuclear weapons as a way to defend their country, although I'm sure that's part of it. But deep down, they know they don't need it. Kim Il-sung has 5,000 tons of biological and chemical weapons and 11,000 pieces of heavy artillery right across the DMZ. They can defend themselves. Instead, what Kim Jong-un has done is he's made nuclear weapons almost the raison d'etre. It's the reason for his government. It's about, in all the North Korean propaganda over the last couple of years is only Kim Jong-un, only I am like this special great leader who can defend you against the terrible West. And the way I can do that is, above all else, we're going to have nukes, and that's going to make us great. And the linkage between those 2 things are so overwhelming. In the same way that in 1968, the communist bloc states are saying to Kim Il-sung, you really don't need the Pueblo. There's no attack going on. The United States isn't planning an attack. We can see that. And Kim Il-sung's answer was, doesn't matter. I need it to rally my people behind me. I need it to stay in power. I make the same argument about Kim number 3. That this isn't about having nukes to defend his country. It's about propping up a tyrannical regime with this excuse that I am protecting you, and only I am the great leader who can keep you safe. The second thing I would say that applies to today, so I'll note, I have like 3 great all-encompassing hatreds in life. Brussels sprouts, the New York Yankees, and American politicians who say that China is the solution to North Korea. Because it isn't. And I think that deep down, most American political leaders know that. I mean, I've seen the briefing papers and I've looked at the congressional studies. I think that there are smart people whispering in their ear that Chinese influence is limited, but the abdication of responsibility here astounds me. For decades, we have known that this country is developing nuclear weapons and chemical and biological, and they're involved in counterfeiting and the international drug trade and everything else, to say nothing of their horrific record on human rights. And yet, to bite the bullet and do what I think deep down they knew needed to be done was a difficult decision. And so a cop-out was always to say, it's China's fault, it's China's responsibility, China can fix this. Don't buy that for a second. You can go all the way back to the Korean War, where we now have records from the projects I was talking to you about. Yeah, China came in and saved North Korea during the Korean War, and the North Koreans hated them. There was a constant power struggle between Kim Il-sung and the Chinese military leaders because Kim was convinced they'd never leave. And they fought out everything, railroad lines, and military bases, and where locations were going to be set up, because Kim was so concerned that the Chinese weren't going to leave when the war ended. And there's this long history of rivalry and suspicion between the two. So this notion that China has the power and the influence over North Korea, and if you want to talk about this in Q&A, I'm happy to do so until my head explodes. But the reality is that Chinese influence is limited, and if the Trump administration is going to deal with this successfully, they need to recognize that. The last thing I want to point out is that the relationship with South Korea is kind of complicated. More so, I think, than most Americans realize. I think that the United States has three great relationships, three special relationships, like the British, the Israelis, and the South Koreans. And there's probably more, but those are, to my mind, those are the big three. And that South Korean relationship is obviously forged in blood. And in no way am I minimizing the extent to which South Koreans in general like and admire the United States, because it is a great relationship. But underneath the surface, there's anti-Americanism maybe too strong, although sometimes it's not. But there is at least a ever-present concern and fear that the United States might abandon it. And it's rooted in all sorts of historical details that we can talk about. 1905 Taft Agreement, the decision to withdraw American troops in 1948, and so on and so on. But it flares up really strongly in 1968. Pak Chung-hee wants to march north. He's irate. And the North Korean people and South Korean people in general are demanding action. And they really start to wonder, is the United States the great ally that they think it is if the U.S. won't help out in 1968? And so that tension has been under the surface for the last 60, 70 years. And what bothers me about the Trump administration and the way that they have handled these last couple of years is that despite whatever American policies are towards the Korean Peninsula, president after president has recognized the importance of the symbolic gesture to keep them on board. So no matter what was going on behind the scenes, the U.S. always treated them publicly as equals and recognized the importance of status and stature inside the South Korean political system. Trump has forgotten, and whether it's on purpose or not, he pays pretty little attention to some of those really small diplomatic niceties that have helped to reassure the South Korean people and government that the United States respects them and will honor that relationship. So whether it's the couple times that the Trump administration has had press releases that refer not to the East Sea, but the Sea of Japan, which the Koreans hate. It's not the Sea of Japan in their eyes, it's the East Sea. Or American demands that they pay for the THAAD missile system, or Trump's complaints that the South Koreans aren't paying anything for the American soldiers stationed in South Korea, even though they are. To all sorts of smaller diplomatic gestures, I think it has really complicated the situation with South Korea. And one of the things that worries me in the long term about American interest in East Asia is that if the Trump administration alienates South Korea a little bit, and particularly in the wake of North Korea's fairly successful charm offensive over the last couple months, there's going to be sort of growing sense inside South Korea that, you know, maybe we need to be more open to the idea of better relations with the North and better relations with China, and maybe we start to diminish the American role inside South Korea. So those are some of my concerns. Again, they're all done with the qualifier that the past and the present aren't always the same thing, but there are things in the back of my mind. And I have been talking forever, so I will stop. Thanks again for the invitation. I will open the floor up for questions. I can talk about this as you've seen forever. So thank you for listening, and the floor is open for questions.
So folks, we're going to use the microphone, please, because we're taping this, and so we need to catch it on the audio system. Before I open to Q&A, I want to make just a couple of comments about some things that Mitch did as a professional historian as he's talking about this, things that professional historians do. For example, when you're trying to explain an event, why something happened, you usually look at what happens at around the same time and just before that might possibly have an influence in this, called historical context. So one of the things that Mitch mentioned was how the Vietnam War was on Johnson's mind and how that might have influenced this. And you could see many other things he's talking about as he's trying to figure out why something happened a particular way. And another thing is the weighing of sources. Just because something occurred doesn't necessarily mean it's important for this particular situation. For example, he's talking about the routine planning that we did in the military to figure out a nuclear option, because that was one of the standard things you would check on. Just because it was created doesn't mean it necessarily had an important impact on this situation. So I just want you to see there are certain ways that historians tend to think about these things. There's many other things we could talk about, but it's a certain style of thinking that helps you explain things in the past. Okay, on to Q&A. All right, so let me hand this to you.
Could you comment on the shoot down of the EC-121 shortly after the Pueblo incident? Relatively, it was within a year after that?
Yeah, so the
Was
story...
this the North Korean Air Force wanting to get their dig in?
So you may know not that long after the Pueblo, right, this thing doesn't end. North Korea shoots down an EC-121 spy plane, killing all 31 Americans on board. We still argue a little bit about that. There's not been as much information from the North Korean materials. There are some who think that was simply an error, that it was a command and control error and military kind of shot down on its own. I've never bought that, because in North Korea, like, independent thought is not really the way you want to go. But you want to advance in the North Korean military, acting on your own is not the way to go. I suspect it's part of this larger wave, that it's part of this sort of larger effort at rallying the people and making a statement about North Korean strength and independence. One of the things that we actually talked about a little bit at the NSA talk I gave the other day is whether or not that was influenced by the American non-reaction to the Pueblo. And I think it probably was. And to the extent that we have seen North Korean messages from this time period, it looks like it probably was. So much as I praise Johnson for handling the Pueblo crisis diplomatically, and I think that was the right measure, the North Koreans also took from it, I think, the idea that they could be more bellicose and aggressive to the United States, and it helped convince them. What's really interesting about the EC-121 is the extent of the Nixon, because when the Nixon administration ran, Nixon ran in 1968, actually attacking the Johnson administration for not doing anything against North Korea in the wake of the Pueblo. And he was all, this would never happen on Nixon's watch. And then he's inaugurated, North Korea shoots down an EC-121, and the internal debates inside the Nixon administration are unbelievable. As like half the room is screaming, Henry Kissinger leading the way, right? We've got to do something, but no one can really figure out what. I mean, again, the Vietnam War hovers over all of this, and sure, you can launch a strike and that'll make you feel good, but what happens in the long run to the larger American military effort in Vietnam? And so much to the incredible frustration of Nixon and Kissinger and his team, they did nothing.
Other questions?
In retrospect, given the second order effects in the communist bloc and in the Western nations, would you say possibly there were more benefits to the West given this situation with the Pueblo than maybe to the communist bloc? I know the intel treasure was significant, but was it outweighed by the fissures, the public cries among the communist leaders later? You did this, and why are you doing this stupid stuff in public?
So that's a great question. I've not been asked that before. I guess I would say no, because of the value of the intelligence loss. And the impact that one of the things we don't do well enough as historians is we don't incorporate intelligence into the larger story. We're starting to, but we need lots of books on the impact of intelligence in the Vietnam War. And so the impact of the loss of the KW-7 and the Walker thing, and the impact that has in Vietnam is too significant for me to say it outweighs the divisions that emerged inside the communist bloc. The other thing I guess I would say is that even while those divisions emerge and everybody hates North Korea, I sometimes say that like the communists hated North Korea almost as much as we did. In the end though, the Sino-Soviet split kind of allows North Korea to play them off against each other. And so to some extent, even while they all didn't get along very well, the system still worked. And North Korea survives by kind of playing both sides off against each other to get aid and support, even while no one's happy about it and happy about them. So on a practical level, there's all sorts of tension and hostility inside the communist bloc. And they cut back on aid. The Soviets are actually pretty concerned that North Korea is going to develop a nuclear weapon, and so they're stalling to the extent that they can on North Korea's nuclear efforts in the 60s. But by and large, like if I had to weigh those two things, the U.S. suffers more because of the intelligence loss and the impact on the 83 crewmen. But it is important to recognize, as you say, the impact this has inside the communist bloc as well.
Other questions?
After the crew was released, were there any court-martials for the Busher or any of the officers?
So I didn't get to talk about this. It's something I always get asked, and I probably should have talked about it. So the crew comes home, and there's much rejoicing, right? They land in San Diego. Everyone is thrilled. They're heroes. Everyone loves them. But then deep inside the Navy, they hate them, right? The Navy, not necessarily the men, but the leadership, the officers. Because in the Navy's eyes, you go down with a fight, right? You never surrender your ship. So they had blood in their eyes to get Booker and some of his commanding officers. So they set up a court of inquiry to investigate, and it's long hearings and investigations, most of which was done in private briefings, some of which was public. 5-man board of investigators who actually fly to the USS Banner to get a sense of what the ship is like, the whole thing. And in the end, they conclude that they recommend courts-martials for a couple of them. I think it's 3 of them, Booker and 2 others. Letters of admonition for a couple others. And they single out a bunch of others as, not really spectacular leadership, but okay. And so for a brief moment, it looks like Booker and his executive officer Harris, and then maybe Executive Officer Murphy, and maybe Steve Harris, who's in charge of the intelligence operations, are going to be court-martialed, but public opinion rises up. And there's a real outswell of support for the men from the American people who say, are you kidding? Right, these guys spent 11 months in a North Korean prison camp, and you didn't have support forces ready to defend them, and you didn't give them guns, and now you're going to court-martial them? So the Secretary of the Navy overrules it. Nobody gets away with anything except some public criticism. But behind the scenes, the men are forced out. So most of them just want to get out of the Navy anyway, but some of the officers want to stay. And I don't know how much of this is maybe an overreaction on their part, but they always felt like every room they went into, people are whispering and pointing. And maybe it's legitimate, maybe it's not. There's lots of stories about them, like, we'll walk into a bar and sit down at a table, and the table gets up and leaves. So they never felt welcome. They felt kind of drummed out, and so within a few years, they're all out. One of the things I'm really critical of the Navy of is that they provided these guys no support for the transition back into civilian life. They just wanted this to go away. They never wanted to talk about it. So the men got no training on how to deal with the last year and become civilians again. So, literally none. And so, I met many of the men. There's a history of alcoholism, of drug abuse, of unemployment, of divorce, suicide. And many of them have told me they just, they couldn't handle the nightmares. And the Navy or the American government never really gave them any support or training as to how to get back into life. Because I just give you one quick example. In 94, I think it's 94, the military creates the Prisoner of War Medal, specifically to honor people who have suffered in prison camps. They won't let the Pueblo men get it because they say it wasn't really a war. Right? This is a Prisoner of War Medal. You guys were on an intelligence mission, it's not really a war. Now that's first of all kind of silly because it still was a war, right? The Korean War is still going on because there was never a military, never an actual treaty, just a military armistice. But beyond that, to look at these men and say you guys don't deserve the Prisoner of War Medal, even though you spent 11 months in a North Korean prison camp, is kind of ridiculous. And so Commander Booker kind of rallied the men, they pressured Congress, and eventually they did get the medal. But the Navy kind of fought against them the whole time. So that's sort of a symbol of what it was like for them coming back.
Other folks?
Yeah, I wonder about a posthumous medal for the one that died in the attack. And then also, I believe I read that the ship and the crew, that the commander of the ship, they were unaware of recent North Korean aggression, like the incursion to try to take the Blue House. And had they been made aware of that, they might have perhaps been able to prepare with what little armament they had in case aggression happened on the water, which we know did. So I wonder what you think about
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So,
Oh, and if I could, one last thing. As far as their leadership and heroism, the photographs, in my opinion, showing them using their digit to secretly show their obvious disdain for the North Koreans was heroic. They did it at their own peril, and it also showed that the leadership, the men were still following their leaders since they were all doing it.
yeah, so you're absolutely right. So Dwayne Hodges, the one who was killed, does get, he gets a lot of honors. I mean, he gets any number of medals in the wake of coming back. And in fact, so yesterday I was at the National Security Agency to give a talk, and the Center for Cryptologic History to give another talk. And you may know, so inside the NSA there's their wall of heroes for people who have died in doing communications operations. And Dwayne Hodges is on that wall. And he kind of shouldn't be, because he wasn't an intelligence operator, right? He wasn't part of the intelligence detachment of the crew. He was the fireman. And so I guess there was some debate about, but in the end, they put him on that wall. Because, to their credit, they decided, even though he wasn't one of us, and he wasn't NSA, and he wasn't Navy intelligence, he was killed in the line of fire trying to destroy crypto gear. And that qualified him for that wall. And there's a mock-up of that wall in the center, so that's why I feel like I can talk about it. There's a mock-up of that wall in the center that you can go and see if you haven't already. And there's maybe only 100 names on it. I mean, it's a pretty small list. So to be on that wall is an honor, I think, to Hodges. You asked about the warning, and you're so right. So somehow it never occurred to anybody to send a message to the Pueblo leadership that the Blue House raid had just transpired, that, Korea is awash in anger and hostility, and there may even, within a day or two of the attempted assassination of Park Chung-hee, a number of American generals actually think we're going to war. And I've looked at their oral histories, and they're saying, that first 24 hours, we really thought there was going to be a war. You'd think somebody might have let the commander of a ship operating off the coast of North Korea know that, oh, by the way, there may be a war. And Bucher has been clear that if he had gotten that message, rather than arm the ship, he would have broken, he would have taken off. He would have made sure the ship was 18, 20, 25 miles off the coast, rather than just 12 miles, just to be safe. But no one bothered to tell him. And then with regard to the middle finger and other things, you're right there also. And the thing is, even while Bucher gets a lot of criticism for the Navy, for surrendering the ship, for not going down without a fight, even the Navy, which is critical of him, recognizes that in captivity, he did an incredible job as an inspirational leader. He is beaten and tortured the worst. The only guy who's beaten and tortured as badly as him is the Marine. There's a Marine who's the toughest guy of all of them, who gets them. This guy is beaten. There are 4 men in a room, and the other 3 guys in the room have said, he would come back from his torture session, everyone else would go for an hour or 2, he'd go for 10 hours, and he would come back, they couldn't even recognize him, he was beaten so badly. But he was also one of the Korean linguists, and they found that in his personnel file, but his Korean language skills were so bad, they thought he was lying. They would torture him to get him to speak Korean, and he was so bad, they were like, no, we know that you were better than that, and they kept torturing him. So he and Bucher probably got it the worst. And for Bucher and he was pretty bad that first week. He was beaten and he was desolate. To pull himself together and organize the resistance that he did, it's a testimony to him and to some of the others who helped coordinate it with him.
Anybody else?
The sister ship of Pueblo, the banner
Yeah.
that you mentioned, was that also stationed off of North Korea?
2 of its 16 missions were off North Korea. One was the end of '66 and one was early '67.
Yeah.
And we now know that, or we suspect pretty strongly, based on intercepts of North Korean messages, that they thought Pueblo was the banner. That when they went out to capture it, they thought it was the banner, and they were coming to get revenge for the banner's earlier missions.
Okay. I lived in San Diego at that time, and so I was very familiar with Pueblo. But the other thing to keep in mind, and what you had mentioned, historical concept in terms of within 2 to 3 weeks after Pueblo was the New Hampshire primary. And McCarthy ending up beating LBJ, and LBJ leaving the campaign.
Yeah.
It had to have had an impact on this because of the Pueblo also, I would think.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. I haven't really written or thought about that. So, that's the New Hampshire primary. LBJ actually he beats McCarthy in that primary, but McCarthy's showing is so astounding. It kind of, it's the beginning of the end for him. I'm thinking out loud here, but I think that maybe to some extent Johnson's decision to not run, which he announces I think on March 31st, frees him up a little bit, right? So that he's not, I'm not going, gung-ho after that I gotta wait this out because I really want those men back. And, we know now in 68 he's so concerned with his legacy. How are people gonna remember me? If you read Johnson's memoirs, you see this over and over again, he doesn't want to be remembered as a warmonger, right? He feels like I've done so much for civil rights, I've done so much for education, and this is all everybody's talking about. It was agonizing for him. So I think maybe now, right, he's done, he's lost, he knows in February of 68, he pretty well knows he's out, and that helps him. Yeah, it's a really good point. It frees him up to say, okay, I'm going out as the peace candidate. I'm not going to see these men killed. I'm not going to launch a second war in Korea because I want my legacy to be civil rights. Yeah.
Others?
Maria, back there to today.
Yeah.
Comment you're making about how we've looked back in the past, but now let's look here in the next few weeks with the President having his meeting. Just the last day or two, you had Admiral Harris being announced from going to Australia, now being posted into Korea. Since that post has been vacated all this time, what are your thoughts now looking at with that new decision?
I'm thrilled, but it's what's the saying about a dollar short and a dime? Right, so right. It's astounding to me that we don't have an ambassador in South Korea. It's so mind blowing, and it's not just me. So you can go online and read the English translations of like the Korea Times, which is a pretty conservative paper anyway. But they're sort of irate about this, right? This notion that the United States doesn't care enough about Korea to even have an ambassador. I thought Victor Cha would have made a decent ambassador. I know Victor a little bit. He's a little hawkish for me, but he certainly is knowledgeable. He understands the nation. He understands the culture. And so when I was talking about sort of the relationship between the United States and South Korea and what South Koreans sometimes see as sort of an insult or a slap in the face, this is front of the list. Like the idea that the United States is negotiating with North Korea that doesn't even have an ambassador in Seoul is really shocking to them. And it's one of those things that I think impacts the future of the relationship. Now, I'm glad that someone has been appointed. It's too little, too late. Maybe it will help with the larger relationship, but I'm really, and maybe I'm overreacting. So I was in Seoul a couple months ago, and I talked with lots of, I'm going off on a tangent, that's what I do. I talked to a lot of these political leaders in South Korea. And that was the kind of thing they brought up all the time. If the United States is really our great ally, and they're really our great friend, how can this possibly happen? And it worries me. So my great fear, right, for the Korean Peninsula is war. And I have long argued there's no way there's going to be war. I mean, the consequences of war on the Korean Peninsula are so unbelievably devastating with the armaments that's up there, devastating to the economy, devastating. I mean, there's no way there could be war. And then, of course, they appointed John Bolton. So now I'm a little less sure about that. But that's my great fear. My second fear in terms of like American interest, now this is not a humanitarian issue in the same way, but my concern in terms of looking forward to American interest in the Korean Peninsula and East Asia in general is this. If talks now fall apart, as I expect they're probably going to, and if Kim is, and I think Kim's been brilliant in his diplomacy to this point. If he does something that maybe quietly provokes Trump a little bit, or provokes Bolton a little bit, and the United States responds, so let's say North Korea walks away, and again, I'm just sort of brainstorming here. North Korea walks away from the table, citing all of the claims that the Trump administration has made about how they forced him to the table. Right? We've been seeing that in the newspapers the last couple of days, that the North Koreans are mad, they don't want Trump taking all this credit, and maybe they won't meet after all, and they want the U.S. to stop military exercises, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they walk away from the table, and Trump, in an effort to get them back to the table, does something. Could be, you know, the bloody nose strategy they talked about, some kind of quick strike, or it could just be announcing a crackdown, sanctions, embargo, whatever. And it provokes a situation. So my worst fear is Kim Jong-un responds militarily. My second worst fear is that he doesn't respond militarily, and instead he doubles down on his domestic propaganda inside South Korea, which I've seen a lot of lately, which says to South Korea, hey, I'm still one of you, and the Americans are willing to risk your lives. Right? So if Trump, if any president, God forbid, launches a quick strike, even a small little attack on North Korea, I think Kim may not respond. Instead, he's going to say to the South Korean people, and there's this great sort of Korean nationalism, this Korean ethnic heritage. He's going to say to the Korean people, you know, the only thing keeping you alive is me. Because Trump wanted war, the United States wanted war. They were willing to kill all 20 million people living in Seoul, and I decided not to because I still love you and we're still one nation and one people. And the impact that's going to have on American influence in the region is going to be incredible. Because there is still that sentiment inside South Korea. There is a vocal left wing in South Korean politics, some of whom are tied to the current administration. I think Moon Jae-in is not as leftist as we sometimes make him out to be, but some of his advisors really are. And I could see this suddenly being a flare-up of the South Korean left saying, you know what, the United States really isn't as much of our friend as we thought if they were willing to spark a war, and Kim is the only thing that kept us from it. The impact that will have on American influence in that region is devastating. So, God, that was a long answer, wasn't it? But yeah, I am really worried about the lack of an ambassador and the impact that has on the South Korean sense of their strength of their relationship with the United States and the ramifications of that going forward.
So, one more question on the history. At any point after Pueblo, does the Navy do its own internal after-action assessment, and in the wake of the tsunami of ineptitude that you've made clear to us, come to grips with the fact of the mission was ill-conceived, the ship was not prepared, the mission was conducted poorly, et cetera, or was it the case that doing so would have led to the wrong kinds of people having to account for it, and was this as easy to make the crew the scapegoats and to sweep the whole thing away?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So the Navy does undertake examination. They want to figure out what went wrong. And it's not just Pueblo. Bear in mind, in 67 was the Liberty, and 64 is the Gulf of Tonkin. So suddenly, you know, someone has to say, what's going on here? So I've seen the studies, and there's all sorts of recommendations as to how to fix this. One of the things they do immediately, to their credit, is the incredible overload of paper materials that the Pueblo was carrying, they stop that. They order a much better system for determining how much classified material each ship actually does have to carry, so that if something happens, it doesn't fall into enemy hands. They also order that the ships need to have a better self-destruct system. But really, in the end, they just scrap the system. And what happens is they decide we'll be a lot safer flying U-2s and using satellites. And so pretty quickly, the system, the whole click beetle operation and similar operations fall apart. With regard to kind of the finger of blame, there's a couple people in naval intelligence who, you know, quietly get letters of criticism in their jacket. But by and large, this whole thing just gets swept under the rug, and no one really wants to talk about anything. Anything else?
You know, when you were talking about the self-destruct, it was an old ship. Didn't it have a seacock? Like
No, it was one of the few ships of that model that didn't have seacocks. And I've never found out why, but it didn't. And I think when Hooker took it over, that he assumed it did, and didn't pressure for the emergency destruct system for a while until they started taking it out and doing so. The in-serve testing is in August of '67, when they finally start saying, hey, what about this and this and this? And that's when he says, oh my God, you're right. and starts pushing. At one point, they bring a couple experts in, they talk about setting up a thermite system to destroy the ship, but the ship was just such a physical mess that he was worried about having any sort of extra explosive device on board. And in the end, I actually think something probably would have gotten done because he was creating such a stink. Had they come back from this first mission, it probably would have made some kind of changes. But of course, you know, closing the barn door after the horse is gone.
Anybody else? All right, well, let's thank this wonderful professor.